John of St. Thomas summarizes the position of Cajetan in 3 statements, and he defends them one by one, especially against Bellarmine and Suarez. The first statement, he writes, is that a heretical pope, precisely by the fact of heresy, is not deprived of the papacy, nor is he deposed. Now, he proves this by the fact that before the 2 admonitions that St. Paul speaks of, the pope is not deposed. For if he repents because of these admonitions, he cannot be avoided, nor consequently deposed. So the simple fact of being a heretic does not make him deposed. Now, this is the key passage, because it shows that the position of Cajetan and John of St. Thomas is not really different from what Bellarmine and Suarez say with regard to the final point of the necessity of an intervention of some authority in the deposition of the Pope. Because as John St. Thomas just said, Bellarmine and Suarez accept that the Pope, by the very fact that he is a heretic and declared incorrigible, is immediately deposed by the Lord. Therefore, their ipso facto doesn't exclude some declaration by some authority, namely the bishops, since they are the only divine authority in the church except for the Pope. Suarez, for example, writes, if the Pope is heretical and incorrigible, when first by the legitimate jurisdiction of the church, a declaratory sentence of the fine is preferred against them, he ceases to be Pope. This is the common opinion of doctors which is gathered from Clement I in his first epistle, where he says that Peter taught that a heretical pope must be deposed. And similarly, further on, he says, from whence it is clear that by divine right the pope is deposed once the sentence of the church has been pronounced. Lata ecclesiae sententia. So there has to be a sentence of the church, according to Suarez. Now, Bellarmine doesn't go into much detail as Suarez, but he does say very clearly, with regard to the second opinion which he treats, which says that the Pope ceases to be Pope by the very fact of being a heretic. Well, he says, for me, this is not approved. This is not proved. For it is true that jurisdiction is given to the Pope by God. However, it is by the concurrent work of men, because it is from men that this man, who before was not Pope, begins to be Pope. Therefore, it is not taken away by God, except by men. But an occult heretic cannot be judged by men, therefore. So this is basically the same point made by Cajetan and John of St. Thomas, the Popes. The papacy is not taken away by God except by men. Now, obviously not by any man. It has to be someone who has authority to do so, namely the bishops. The second point of Cajetan's position, given by St. John of St. Thomas, is that even in the case of heresy, the church has no authority over the Pope, because Christ made him the sole head of the church. And we insist on this very strongly. He writes, no exception has been made by Christ the Lord in which this authority of the Pope is limited and is subjected to another. But always, and with regard to everything, he speaks of it as being supreme and monarchical. When he speaks of heresy, however, he does not attribute any authority over the Pope, but only commands to avoid and separate from and not communicate with the heretic, all of which does not indicate any superiority and can take place without it. Therefore, the authority of the church is not superior with respect to the authority of the Pope, even in the case of heresy. And this is shown clearly by the laws which say that the first see is judged by no man, as we said before, which also applies in the case of infidelity, for the fathers congregated in the case of Pope Marcellino said, you judge yourself. And finally, he gives the third statement, which is the full exposition of Cajetan's precise explanation of how this delicate but necessary operation of the deposition of a heretical pope takes place in a way that does not violate the principle he just stated of the absolute independence of the power of the pope with regard to any human power. He writes, the third statement is that the authority of the church has as its object the application of the authority of the pope to a person, designating him by election, and the separation of this authority from a person by declaring him a heretic and to be avoided by the faithful. So, the ministerial authority that the church has in creating the Pope, by designating him as the person who receives the authority from Christ, is taken as the key to understand how she can depose the Pope without violating the principle that she can have any authority over him. For just as she did not give authority to the Pope, but rather simply designated by election the person to whom God gave it, so also she does not take away the authority of the Pope, but rather induces a disposition in him that is incompatible with that authority, from which follows God's action of taking away that authority.